The first time someone tried to claim my lake, they didn't come with a lawyer. They came with a clipboard and a smile, so confident it almost felt official. And I remember standing there on my own gravel driveway thinking, well, this is either going to be the dumbest misunderstanding of my life or the beginning of a fight that's going to last a long time. Because land has a strange way of changing people, especially when they think it might belong to them. The ranch road hasn't changed much in 30 years. It's still the same narrow strip of gravel winding through pine trees, the same dust lifting behind the tires when you drive in too fast, the same quiet that makes you feel like the world ended a few miles back. My uncle used to say the road was part of the test. If someone wasn't willing to drive it, they probably didn't belong here anyway. That morning the air smelled like pine and wet clay from the lake. The house sat where it always had, cedar, siding faded to gray, porch rail leaning just a little too far, the water stretching out behind it like a sheet of steel reflecting the sky. 3,000 acres of land, a lake built by hand in the 60s, and not a single HOA in sight when my uncle first dammed the creek. He used to stand by the spillway with a wrench in one hand and say things that sounded simple until years later when they started making sense. Water is power, he told me once when I was 16, and power attracts people who didn't build it. I didn't really understand what he meant back then, but I did the morning the first letter arrived. It was sitting in my mailbox between a grocery ad and a credit card offer. Plain white envelope, no tracking number, just a small green logo in the corner. Ridgewood Estates Homeowners Association. Now Ridgewood was a subdivision about half a mile away. Neat houses, tidy lawns, the kind of place where the grass gets measured and the mailboxes all match. When they built it in the early 90s, nobody thought much about it. Just another development creeping out into ranch country. I assumed the letter was some kind of neighborhood notice. It wasn't. Inside was a single page written in careful, polite language, the kind that sounds friendly but leaves no room for disagreement. The HOA would soon begin scheduled oversight of the lake to ensure environmental safety and shared community use. That phrase sat there on the page like it belonged. Shared community use. The strange part wasn't that they asked. It was that they didn't. There was no request anywhere in the letter. Just an assumption. Like someone had already decided the lake belonged to them, and the paperwork would catch up later. I read it twice, then set it on the kitchen table and opened the binder where I kept the ranch documents. My uncle had been obsessive about records. Deeds, surveys, water rights, maintenance logs, everything dated, signed, filed. At the time, I used to think it was overkill. That morning, I realized it was preparation. The lake wasn't just part of the land. It was officially registered as a private agricultural impoundment in 1963, exclusive water use rights attached to Parcel 731A. In simple terms, the lake legally belonged to the ranch. Always had. And Ridgewood hadn't even existed when those papers were filed. So instead of calling the HOA, I drove into town and visited the county annex. If you've never been inside a rural records office, it feels like walking into a library where the books decide who owns the world. The clerk pulled the Ridgewood charter for me, for 100 acres total. My ranch sat nearly half a mile beyond the boundary. No shared roads, no easements, no water agreements, nothing. I traced the subdivision border with a pencil, then circled my parcel in black. The two shapes never touched, which should have been the end of the story. But the strange thing about authority is that sometimes people accept it before checking whether it exists. A few weeks later, a second letter arrived. This one included a map. Stylized. Clean. The subdivision shaded pale green and my lake labeled in bright blue. Ridgewood Lake Community Resource. Just like that. A new name. No citation. No explanation. Just confidence. And confidence spreads. Soon neighbors started mentioning it casually. I thought the HOA maintained the lake. Didn't they organize cleanup events there? I heard it was always shared. That was when I realized Karen's real strategy. Karen was the HOA president, and she didn't need to prove ownership. She only needed people to believe it long enough that the idea started sounding normal. Because once a story repeats enough times, it starts feeling like truth. The first time her staff showed up at my gate, they came wearing matching polo shirts and carrying clipboards. They stood outside the fence, smiling politely. "Just here for site observation," one of them said. I didn't open the gate. "This property isn't part of Ridgewood," I told them. The woman nodded calmly. "The lake connects to the Ridgewood Environmental Watershed. No such designation existed." But she said like it did. They left without entering. A week later, a drone flew over the spillway. After that came newsletters, community timelines, and printed photos showing families fishing along the shoreline, presented as proof of decades of shared use. Neighbors began repeating the phrase Ridgewood Lake like it had always been called that. For a while, I stopped correcting them. Not because I agreed, but because arguing stories with stories only feeds the noise. Instead, I started documenting everything. Every letter, every drone flight, every attempted visit, dates times photographs. Because my uncle taught me something else about land disputes. The loudest person usually loses. The one with the records usually wins. Then one afternoon, while reorganizing the old fireproof box in the closet, I found something I'd never seen before. A thin manila folder buried under the tax receipts. Inside was the original state filing for the lake. Not just a deed attachment, a full surface water impoundment registration. Exclusive control of the water body, the spillway, and the outflow system. Filed March 14, 1963. Nearly 30 years before Ridgewood Estates existed. I drove straight to the county office the next morning. The clerk pulled the microfilm archive. County seal intact. Active. Never amended. She adjusted her glasses and said something that changed the entire situation. "You don't see many of these anymore," she said quietly. "This one is airtight." That was the moment the fight stopped being defensive. Because Karen had been building a story. Now I had history. 2 weeks later, she escalated. Certified letter. Notice of noncompliance. Daily fines if I refused HOA oversight of the lake. That was the moment her narrative turned into enforcement. And enforcement requires authority. So when the HOA scheduled a public meeting to clarify the lake situation, I showed up. The clubhouse was arranged like a courtroom. Projector screen, folding chairs, board members seated at a long table with Karen in the middle. She spoke calmly about cooperation and community responsibility. Slides appeared showing people fishing along my shoreline. Children standing on the dock. Neighborhood events framed as shared tradition. Then she asked if I'd like to respond. I stayed seated. "I brought 5 documents," I said. The room went quiet. First, the 1963 exclusive water filing granting private control of the lake. Second, a certified boundary survey confirming the lake sits entirely inside parcel 731A. Third, the county jurisdiction map showing the HOA boundary nowhere near the property. Fourth, my written request for legal authority supporting the HOA's enforcement actions. Unanswered. Fifth, the county acknowledgement of the updated survey filing. I placed the papers on the table. "I'm not negotiating access," I said calmly. "I'm clarifying the record." Karen tried once more. "Community identity isn't always defined by paperwork," she said. "Sometimes by shared memory." I nodded. Memory doesn't create jurisdiction. The meeting ended without a vote. 3 weeks later, the county sent its decision. Ridgewood HOA had no authority over the lake. Every notice they issued was invalid. Every attempted fine was unauthorized. And the county fined the HOA $7,500 for administrative overreach. 2 board members resigned within days. Karen stepped down the following month. Quietly. No apology. Just a single line in the meeting minutes. President resigned. And that's the funny thing about justice sometimes. It doesn't come with shouting or dramatic courtroom speeches. Sometimes it arrives quietly in a brown envelope stamped by the county clerk. The lake didn't change after that. The spillway hummed the same way it always had. The reeds moved in the wind. The shoreline stayed exactly where it had been since 1963. But the story around it changed. Neighbors stopped calling it Ridgewood Lake. They started calling it what it had always been. Mine. Standing on the dock one evening, watching the water move under the sunset, I finally understood what my uncle meant all those years ago. Land doesn't belong to the loudest voice. It belongs to whoever took the time to protect it. Karen believed repetition could turn a story into truth. But records don't care how many times something is repeated. They only care about what was written first. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't argue. It's quietly place the truth on the table and let time decide which version survives. So now I'm curious what you think. If a community uses something for years without permission, does that eventually give them a right to it? Or should ownership always belong to whoever holds the legal record? Because situations like this happen more often than people realize. HOAs stretching their authority, neighbors assuming access, and someone finally deciding to check the paperwork. Tell me honestly, if you were in my position, would you have fought Karen the same way, or would you have let the lake become a shared community resource just to keep the peace?